It was, to a lesser degree, a version of the same crisis that I saw my parents facing. In the grander houses in the villages where we lived, you could still see signs saying "tradesman's entrance," directing the vulgar to a side door. We could not aspire to that sort of standing, but it was considered essential by my mother in particular that the Hitchenses never sink 1 inch back down the social incline that we had so arduously ascended. That way led to public or council housing, to the rough boys who would hang out around outside cinemas and railroad stations, to people who went on strike and thus held the country to ransom, and to people who dropped the H at the beginnings of words and used the word toilet when they meant to refer to the lavatory. In Fifeshire, we had briefly had a babysitter called Jeanie, a large, ruddy, motherly proletarian whose husband was a crane driver in the Navy dockyard. She once took my brother to her council house for tea, by which she meant dinner, or at least early supper, a meat and potato fest rammed home with a mug of hot and sweet brown nectar. Peter was fascinated, above all, by the way her husband ate off his knife. That is to say, I swear that my mother went chalk white when she heard of this. All I ever had to do if I wished to tease her was to wield my knife as if it were a fork, or to hold it as if it were a pen, or to mouth the word toilet. Lesser prohibitions and anxieties, note paper for writing paper, mirror for looking glass, were not absolute. Phone for telephone was, however, considered distinctly vulgar. My first introduction to the Mitford sisters and their impossible glamour and charm was by way of Nancy's Guide to the Pitfalls of Class and the fashion in which all English people are branded on the tongue, either by their accent or by their vernacular. In this unending social battle, in which private education was necessary but not sufficient condition for victory, the Hitchen's chin was barely above the ever-rising floodwaters. At any moment my father might lose his latest job, and we had no capital of any kind on which to fall back. He himself had relatives who, I find I have to confess this, bought a china plaque with the word toilet and helpfully screwed it to the outside of their lavatory door, to the door of the actual room with the bath and the wash basin in it. They also affixed a plaque saying bathroom. Their house was a 5-room bungalow, where it was hard to get lost. Thank heaven for the Englishman who invented the saving term loo. My mother's exquisite pain at this sort of thing was further accented by deep reticence about her own family background. And all this strain was being undergone so that I, the firstborn, could become an English gentleman at precisely the time when the market for such a finished product was undergoing a steep decline. Thus I have to be honest and say that the single book that most altered my life was How Green Was My Valley. One day I took up a tattered paperback copy of Richard Llewellyn's classic. It was a Pan or Penguin edition, proclaiming it the bestseller of the war years, which meant that it seemed kosher to me, and then sat as if snared by an enchantment until I had finished it. Then I read it again. In the next few years I inhaled and imbibed it dozens of times, and could at any moment have sat for an examination on its major and minor themes. The world and experience of its boy narrator, Hugh Morgan, became more real to me than my own. It was an earthquake, a climacteric, a revelation. It was one of those rural and suburban boys who, like Ruskin, when taking the railway across North London, would feel the impulse to pull down the blinds as my train went through the scenes of ugliness and misery and desolation in places called Hackney Downs and London Fields. Once, after staying with a school friend on the Mumbles Peninsula of South Wales, I had been as distressed as William Blake by my brief glimpse of the Hellmouth scenes of the steelworks and coal pits around Port Talbot. But now I realize that just on the other side of the bright Bristol Channel, from the lovely moors and uplands of my upbringing, there was a world as remote from my own as the moon, or as Joseph Conrad's Congo. Several aspects of this hitherto occluded other Britain lodged in the mind. First of all, its inhabitants worked mostly underground, like the Morlocks in H.G. Wells. Second, they spoke a non-English language at home and at church, and considered themselves conquered and dispossessed as a nation, as well as suppressed as a class. Third, they thought of going on strike as an act of unselfish solidarity and emancipation rather than as holding the country to ransom. Fourth, though I do not know why I am placing this last on my list, they conceived of education and learning as the avenues to a better life, for their fellows as well as themselves, and not as expensively bought means of declaring themselves superior to others less fortunate. This was a jolt to my system, and no mistake. Indeed, it was a severe and seismic shock to all the other systems that had ungirded my own little position. In the annals of good bad, then, I would put How Green Was My Valley in the same class as Uncle Tom's Cabin, a work that leaves an ineradicable scratch on the mind, to borrow Harold Isaac's useful phrase. There was another element as well. At a certain point, on some springy turfed Welsh hillside far above the scenes of alienation and exploration that lay below, young Hugh contrived to part with his irksome virginity. Richard Lewin handled this transition with very slightly too much quasi-poetic euphemism, his crucial error being, to my fevered imagining, the idea that the inflamed heat of a young manhood could be assuaged only by the relative coolness of a feminine interior. One had had a vague hope that the ardency would be appeased by an even greater heat, rather than sizzled like a red-hot horseshoe dipped in water. But at this stage I would have been willing to settle for anything that offered incandescence in either direction. It interested me very much later on to discover that Who's creator, Richard Llewellyn, was not at all the fire-eating partisan of the coal miner's struggles that I had taken him to be, but rather a conservative and old-fashioned type who had been setting down a world he had lost. It only goes to show, if you spend a certain amount of every day memorizing the following incantations, the effects may not always be the ones that are intended. Teach us, good Lord, to serve thee as thou deservest, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and to ask for no reward, save that of knowing that we do thy will. That is from Ignatius Loyola, or this from Sir Francis Drake himself. O Lord God, when thou hast given thy servants to endeavor any great matter, grant us also to know that it is not the beginning but the continuing of the same, until it be thoroughly finished, which yieldeth the true glory, through him that for the finishing of thy work laid down his life. Even when you have learned about Loyola's fanaticism or Drake's piracy, verses like these have the faculty of recurring to one at apt or critical moments. Years later I read Lionel Trilling on George Orwell's attachment to traditional and martial values. Trilling guessed that Orwell esteemed these supposedly conservative virtues because he thought they might come in handy later on, as revolutionary ones. And this is partly why I can't entirely second or echo his own great memoir of prep school misery. For me, the experience of being sent away at a tender age was at any cost, finally, an emancipating one. I knew I hadn't been dispatched to boarding school to get me out of the way, an assurance that I don't think young Orwell shared. I knew it was my only eventual meal ticket for a decent university, that undiscovered country to which no Hitchens had yet traveled. I knew that I owed my parents the repayment of a debt. True, I did get pushed around and unfairly punished and introduced too soon to some distressing facts of existence. But I would not have preferred to stay home or to have been sheltered from these experiences, and it was probably good for me to be deprived of my adoring mother and taught. I can still remember the phrase that I wasn't by any means the only pebble on the beach. Why I once inquired was the school boxing tournament into which I had been entered against my will called the 90%. Because, Hitchens, the fight involves only 10% skill and 90% guts. This seemed, even then, like a parody of a Tom Brown story, and I had the socks knocked off me in the ring, but why do I remember it after half a century? The school motto was, ut prosim, that I may be useful. And when one has joined the singing of I Vow to Thee, My Country, especially on 11th of November by the War Memorial, or The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is ended, to sing is to pray twice, as St. Augustine put it, then one may in fact be very slightly better equipped to face that Japanese jail or Iraqi checkpoint. I have just looked up the gleaming new website of Mount House and realized that if I have set all this down in my turn, it is because I was among the last generation to go through the old school version of Englishness. The site speaks enthusiastically of the number of girls being educated at the establishment, of the availability of vegetarian diets and caterings for other special needs, and of its sensitivity to various sorts of learning disability. Now, I cannot say I am completely sorry to think that there will be no more "Eat that mutton, Hitchens," or "Bend over that chair, Hitchens," or "Shall we call him Christine, boys? He's so feeble." But something in me hopes that it hasn't all become positive reinforcement, with high marks, constantly awarded for mere self-esteem.